Alright guys, just want to say before I get going here, thank you very much for coming tonight. This is the first time we've done it in the store here. This is where we usually produce the baits back here. I really got to thank you guys for buying stuff in my store here, trying to get a good tackle shop for Essex County, and trying to get the stuff guys want in here and not to be too expensive. So thank you guys for every penny you've spent in the store. Appreciate it. So tonight I'm going to talk about. I'm just keeping a seat warm for Mark, which I know you guys are all here for Mark. So I'm going to talk about vertical jig in the river, and it's something I've done my whole life. I learned it from Butch Harker, Drake Fields. A lot of you guys know them guys when I was a little kid, and doing it ever since. And when you think about it, very few methods of fishing catch neutral, active, and negative fish like a jig does. So that's why it works so good. It's right in front of the fish. It gets every fish in every mood to eat it. And what you're doing when you're jigging is you're basically mimicking a dying bait fish. The predators have keyed in on abnormality. That's what they're looking for. So when you have a pod of bait going by, they're looking for something acting weird, and that's why they're going after the bait. The upward motion is what gets their attention. They don't hit it on the upward motion. They hit it as it's looking weak and falling down. So that's why you get the most bites when the bait's falling down. It's that weak fall after the jump. So if you've ever seen a dying fish, it does this, right? And then it just falls back like this, and then it gives another gasp and it falls back. That's what you're mimicking when you're jigging. The bait fish could be just old, it could be just finished spawning, it could be a disease, whatever it is, that's what's causing the fish to do that. Before I figure you guys might want to learn a little biology about these fish in this river. And before I was a fishing guide, 30 years ago, a lot of people don't know this about me, 30 years ago I graduated college with my diploma in aquaculture, or fish farming. And I can give you guys a little bit of facts on a walleye. In aquaculture, they gauge how many eggs a fish has by the pound of female. So they say, okay, this fish has 10,000 eggs per this pound. So if it's a 10-pound fish, it's 100,000 eggs. That's how they measure it. Walleye are about 26,000 eggs per pound. So a 10-pounder is going to have 260,000 eggs. They're very small eggs in them. And only about 1% survive to grow big out of that number. The magic number when they're spawning, they'll spawn in the early 40-degree range all the way to like 52, 54 range, but like 90% of them spawn at 44 degrees. That's a magic number. I'll guarantee you, when you look at your depth finder and it says 44, that's the day you're going to see most of them fish coming out of that female, or most of those eggs coming from the female, when it's 44 degrees. And right now we're like 41 and a half, 42. So I'm hoping it backs down a bit. We got some cold snap coming because I don't want them dumping the eggs just yet. So when they dump the eggs, the female usually does it all in one night. The males will last 2-3 weeks. And what happens is the eggs are adhesive. They don't build nests. The eggs are adhesive, and they fall down and they stick in the rocks and little pebbles and stuff like that, and they stick to that for 7 to 10 days until they hatch. And then once they hatch, they float up near the surface, believe it or not. And as they become able to feed on bigger food and stuff, they settle back down to the bottom. By summer, they're down near the bottom, swimming around. So they like the eggs. What they need is where they spawn. Ideally, is like 7 to 10 feet of water, light current with gravel or rock bottom. That's why they don't do good in muck. They want those eggs to fall in the rocky cracks and stuff like that, and then safely hatch. But very few of them survive. It's amazing that we have that much fish out there with that few fish surviving. They seem to come in waves this time of year, early March, mid-March, late March. You'll see guys on the internet, trying to be heroes, pounding them, catching them like crazy, and the next day they go out there and they blank. That's because they come in these pods and the pods are small early on, and as it gets into April, the pods and waves of fish coming through get larger and larger, and schools get larger and larger. They've proven that the vast majority, like 80% of the walleye in this whole region, spawn either out on the reefs on Lake Erie or up in the Maumee River. They theorize that a lot of the fish that are in the Detroit River are just passing through. Most of them. Some spawn in there, but most of them are just passing through, going from Erie to, they've tagged them in Erie and recaptured them in the Tittabawassee River. I mean, they'll go far. And so they've got them going in every direction. The vast majority of them, though, are in Lake Erie. So the problem with that is they get on them reefs out there, you get some 10-foot waves crashing across them reefs within the first week. A lot of them fish are going to die, right? So you just hope that you don't have, and that's what they theorize, why the hatch has gotten as big as it has in the last few years, is it started when we had the high water. That's the only explanation that the DNR in Ohio especially, they said was those big hatches started when we had the higher water. So you put 2 feet of higher water on all them reefs and it somehow maybe protected them. They think it did something with the plankton levels. But the high water is what triggered it, and then there's all these fish now that are spawning, so we're continually getting massive hatches out there. So they come in, it's, like I say, Erie and the Maumee River. You don't really hear, outside of guys fishing in waders and stuff, you don't really hear about the Maumee as a fishery, but they say it's loaded. Now, when I'm fishing for them, I do a couple things different than other people. Most people, when they're jigging the river, they look, when they're fishing, you look at them where they are positioned in their boat, and it's like, has this person ever seen a map of this river? Because they're just blown around in the middle of nowhere. What I do is I really believe that these fish are swimming along the edges of the channels, especially the big ones early on in the year. They're migrating along these edges, just like if you saw a hitchhiker on the road, he's not in a farmer's field somewhere. He's where he's going to have his best luck, feeding and moving, and that's on the edge of the road. So then the walleye are right on the edge of them drops, and so I'm always fishing the drop off, always. I can go in June and fish in 35 foot the rest of the year. This time of year, I'm trying to catch potentially a 10-pounder, you know, and so I am focused on them edges. And what I do different than most is I'm shallow. I'm like 6 to 18 feet deep most of the time. I'm either casting, but mostly jigging. And a lot of people won't do that. They're going to get in the middle of them channels and they're going to jig within the packer boats. But the secret to getting the big numbers and big fish is finding the spots that other guys will pass by because they're either short drifts or it's too hard to stay on that drop off. So you'll find more unmolested fish if you get away from the crowd, get on the edges. Try shallow. That's one thing I can't push hard enough, is try shallow, especially this time of year. So what I'm doing is, when I'm fishing them edges, I'll get on that drop off, and if we catch a fish, the average guy is running for the net. The first thing I do is look at that depth finder, say we are in 12 feet. So when the wind blows me away, I don't have to guess where I was when we caught that first fish. I get right back on that 12 foot on the drop off, and oftentimes it's, you know, the peak of the drop. There's been many days where I've caught them in 8 foot, where we were catching nothing out in 20, you know. So the first thing I do is look at that depth finder, and you know, you never know when you found a little secret spot. Like a lot of times, like if you're fishing on a lake and you troll over a hump, you catch a bunch of fish sometimes. And the reason that happens is when the current goes over a hump, you may not be able to perceive this, but when a current goes over a hump, it compresses that water a little bit and it speeds up that current just a fraction. And you go, how could the fish know that? Well, if a fish can detect a 1/10 of a degree in water temperature change, and he can detect that, and that current speeds up. And so it's important to watch for little things like that in the river. When you're jigging the river, if you see that bottom come up a little bit, it might only be 5-10 yards across. Those are the key spots that will put you on big fish, is finding little tiny things. So the first thing I do is I look at my depth finder and I go, wait a minute, we're in 14, and the last time I looked at it, we were in 16. and you go back up and you realize there's a big broad point or something that comes off the drop off, or there's a hump there somewhere. And those are the key things to finding your own little molested pot of fish. And the hard part is most guys are too lazy to go up and make a 30-yard drift. And I'm not. I will make short drifts over and over and over. If you find one little spot, and there could be 20 fish up on that little spot, and you pulled one off it, and you say to your buddy, let's go back up to the buoy there. When all them fish were in like that one little 20-yard section. The other thing about that is the current will speed up and slow down every day. If you notice when you're out there fishing, those buoys some days are straight up like this. The next day when the wind's changed or something, then buoys are tipped like this, rocking back and forth. That's going to put the fish in a different position. Say you see a point or a hump in the river. Those fish might be 10 yards behind that thing in a big eddy swirling like this, where the day before they were right on top. So it's very important to be observant when you fish. That's a perfect example of being observant, is when you catch a fish, hey, did I just come over a little rise on the bottom? Keep an eye on that one. Always look at your graph before you worry about netting a fish. So often I try to find areas away from the crowd, spots that guys will avoid. Spots that, especially now with all the fish, you're finding fish in new areas that have been devoid of fish for a while. Finding areas that other guys think don't look any good, maybe the current's a little slower, or you think it's mucky or whatever. Those are the kind of areas where you find unmolested fish that are snapping, and you'll have to yourself. But again, the short drifts, don't be afraid to make a drift that's 50 yards long. You don't need to go down this whole long thing just because it's too much work to lift that trolling motor. Trust me when I tell you, if you bang a couple, go up and make another short drift. Just keep doing that. And at the end of the day, you'll be happy you did that. You have a ton of fish. So, another thing, when I'm fishing an area, I don't try to be wedded to the day before. Whatever happened the day before just gives you a general idea on how you start the next day. Whether it's color, whether it's spot, or whatever. Don't get stuck putting all your eggs in one basket. Keep an open mind. And that's hard for even me to do, is keep an open mind and be willing to just take everything you had tight on, take it off, and start fresh if you ain't caught them in the first half an hour. You got to do that, though. You can't be lazy when you fish. You got to be proactive. So when I'm fishing an area and I've caught them there the day before, you say to yourself, do I need a whole new area, or do I need a change within the area? Do I need to change baits? Do I need to change depth slightly? Just keep experimenting, and you'll catch a ton of fish. So, a lot of times I get asked on the muddy water. It's the biggest problem, especially if guys are coming here from out of town. Guys are always asking me about this muddy water. And the only way that I've been able to catch them pretty good is if it gets muddy. First of all, a lot of people think that the rain causes the muddy water. Rain has got almost nothing to do with it around here because it's so flat. If we were in Kentucky, that's a different story. But it's so flat here, you need 6 inches of rain to have any impact on the water color. It's all about the east and northeast winds that turn up Lake St. Clair. It's so turbid from that wind, because it's so shallow up there, that whenever you see it muddy in the river, I'll guarantee it was north or east or northeast in the days prior. Luckily for us, it clears up quick because we have Lake Huron dumping in all that clean water, and it settles out. The problem we have is water. When you think about it, you don't really see that muddy water in the summertime, and there's multiple reasons for it. The weeds hold that mud down. The weeds have blossomed by summer. It keeps it all tampered down. Plus, water is most dense at 39 degrees. So that means any particles that are in the water column are going to stay suspended longer the colder that water is. In the summertime, that stuff sinks. Now, if you want to test that, you could take a suspended jerk bait and put it in the water right now, and then try that bait in the summertime, and it'll sink to the bottom. So them particles are staying up in the water longer, and it's a problem. The one thing that I've been able to do, when it's first freshly churned up and just nasty as can be, it's very difficult to catch them jigging. Hand line is possibly the only way. So what I do is, the best time to catch them is maybe 1 or 2 days after you'll have a sunny day. So if it's north wind, that's a cold front, you're guaranteed within 2-3 days it's going to be bright sun. And what you want to do then is fish a little shallower than you've been fishing and go after lunch. When that sun is straight above, that's really my only way of catching them in the dirty water is with a jig and a plastic, is use a minnow for one. But in the afternoon, a day or two after it's been muddy, they'll start snapping again, as long as it's sunny out. So through the season, so right now I'll be fishing shallow, and then as you get into May, you know, you can catch them just pretty much anywhere. Bottom bouncing comes into play and this and that. One thing I want you to try though this year, tell me if it works for you, is when you get into summer, like June, when you think the jigging is pretty much done and it's bottom bouncing, if you get a cloudy day, put your boat, say in LaSalle, put your boat in about 15 foot, 14 foot of water, and you'll find a nice weed edge all over the river. Try vertical jigging on that weed edge when it's cloudy, and you'll be shocked at what you catch. Right on that edge of the weeds, you'll catch bass, you'll catch sheephead, you'll catch walleye, you'll catch everything. So that's a good way of catching walleye in the summer, is on a heavy cloud day, jig that weed edge. A lot of guys have never even thought of something like that. So the summer comes, and then, you know, you guys know the general movements of these walleye. So I'm going to go over to tackle a little bit here, and I had to make notes so I don't forget anything. So I'm going to go over to tackle, the equipment. When I'm fishing, first of all, let's talk about staying vertical. There's 5 main reasons why you're not vertical. And you have to follow all these. If you get one factor off, your line's gonna be way out there. First of all, if your buddy's on a trolling motor and it's windy and he's a madman, and that tail, and you're in the back, and that tail end of the boat's going back and forth, you're not gonna be able to stay vertical. Outside of putting a much heavier jig on, if you're not vertical, it's probably your buddy on the front that doesn't know what he's doing, right? That's one thing. If you think you're better, get on up there and show them how it's done. 2, your line is too heavy quite often. When I first started, I'll never forget the first day I ever jigged in that river. I just used whatever line I had, and I had like 20-pound line that I fished with carp with. And it was, but when I dropped that jig down there, it was like a coil, it was like a spring. And I remember when I was jigging, watching that line just coil. And I never caught any. My buddies I was with caught them. You have to have the light line, whether it's they see it or just how it cuts through the water. You have to have, you know, no, I don't use any more than 10. 10-pound braid is a lot stronger than you think. You have to be focused on that trolling motor. This is the difficult thing. What I do is, you'll see it most when we're catching them, you know, my customers are all excited. When I run back up, before I got that trolling motor in the water, these guys are in the water. And that's a mistake, because the boat's still moving. What you want to do is you want to make your boat, your jig, and the current all go the exact same speed down the river. So first thing I do before I give the okay to drop, I look. When I see a bubble or a leave or something, when I'm going the same speed as that, drop. Never before. And often the wind will come, you guys are netting a fish, boat's blowing this way, it's going to push you off your mark. You got to get set again, look for something floating in the water, and it's difficult to stay focused on that trolling motor and focused on, you're trying to fish, you're doing your best to jig it, and the trolling motor seems to be the last thing you're worried about. You have to be on that trolling motor nonstop to stay straight up and down. And don't let too much line out. A lot of guys spend too much time trying to feel the bottom. It's out here. Next thing you know, you might as well reel it up. The quickest way to reset and get vertical again, reel it up real fast, set it back down. It only takes 2 seconds instead of all that frustration. Reel it up, back down it goes. Within seconds, you're back jigging again. So don't let too much line out. And the number one thing that people do not think about is they do not hop it frequently enough. When that jig is up off the bottom and it's swimming through the water column like this, that is what's keeping it vertical. The more you spend with that jig on the bottom for like just a second or two, every second or two, inch by inch, it's pulling away from you. Next thing you know, it's out there. Hop it more frequently. If you let it to the bottom, the second it gets to the bottom, start hopping it. Unless you go through a major depth change, you're down there. Even if you only feel it hit the bottom like every third hop, at least you know you're down there. Keep it hopping more. That helps you big time. Here's a funny sidebar that kind of throws everything I just said in the gutter. One time I had a customer out, and I think gobies played a big part in this. We were jigging, and I was telling them everything I just told you about staying vertical. I looked back, we were on the back side of fighting, on the western side of fighting. I looked back, and we were all catching them. I looked back, and my customer has got his line like almost to the knot. He's way out there. And I looked back and said, man, I said, like I told you like 3 times how to stay vertical. All of a sudden, he sets the hook on a fish. And my mind was blown. I've never seen anybody catch a walleye in the river with that kind of, with a jig. Now, it is way out there. I've never seen this in my life. I said, you got a fish? He's like, oh, I caught every one of them like this. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. This throws it all, this throws my whole thing in the garbage, because I think there's gobies there or something, because why would a fish just have that? Why would that baby scooting along the bottom like that and he's catching fish after fish? You know, I've never really played with that much, but you guys can try it and see if it works for you. I'm not gonna play with it. I just messed my whole game plan up like instantly. So, let's go over to tackle a little bit. Now, some of you guys are very well versed in jigging, but I'm just gonna, not everyone's an expert here, so I'm just gonna go over what you need. You need basically a shorter rod that's got what they call a fast tip. So a fast tip means it's like a sharp action. It's not whippy at all. So a slow tip would be like a fly rod, right? So fast tip is what you need. Shorter rod, definitely a shorter rod. You can say, well, I've always jigged with a 7-foot rod. That's fine. And you'll tell yourself, I can jig 12-inch hops with that long rod, no problem. But I'll guarantee you, subconsciously, you'll go look down and you'll be jigging that thing 2 feet up. It's just because that longer length jigs that jig up higher. It just happens. So the shorter rod helps you not jig it more than 12 inches. Now, I tell myself I'll jig it 12 inches. But in reality, I'm probably 15, 16 inches. The shorter rods with a fast tip. Here's the thing. I'm using these tactical fishing jigging specials. It's our best-selling rod in this store here. I probably sold 150 of these each of the last 2 years. And it is made by a local fisherman who knows how to jig, okay? And we got them in the store, we got them all over. But I'm using this rod probably 90% of the time. But keep this in mind. Not every rod is going to work, not your favorite rod is going to work every day. There are some days where you just can't hook them. Or you're pulling it away from them, or something's going on where your buddy's catching them and you're not. So I would say 90% of the time I'm using this rod, but there are some days where you need to have a second rod on the deck, either a little stiffer or a little softer, to be able to have it at the ready. When you miss 3 or 4 fish in a row, you can grab that other rod, it's got a slightly different action, and send that sucker down there and see if you actually hook up more. So I recommend at least 2 rods on the deck all the time, just to have 2 different actions. So, a lot of guys like to jig with bait cast rods. And I used to do that too. I used to be a bait cast guy because I thought, oh, I'm the best, I'll go to American side and I'll use 2 rods, and it's easier to jig with 2 rods. And then I've gotten away from it. And I've only gotten away from it for one reason. I feel I don't get the hook set that I do with a spinning rod. When I'm jigging like this, okay, and when I go to set the hook, I'm like doing this, like I'm trying to lever it up like this. And I don't feel I get a good hook set doing that. It's just your wrist, it's all in the wrist. You're trying to do this. And I feel that, yeah, you can, it's easier to use 2 rods, but if you try a baitcaster and just keep that in mind, the hook set, the way you have to hook set with a baitcaster is totally different than doing this. I find that I personally get a much better hook set with a spinning rod, and I've gotten all the baitcasters off the boat, and all my customers and I, we always use spinning rods now, just because of the hook setting advantage with that. I feel like I'm able to pull it up quicker, and I think it's the best way to go on that. I mean, I'll sell you whatever you want, but I think you're gonna have, especially new fishermen, you're gonna have a much better hook set. As far as baits go, here's generally how I run my spring. So right now, I'm gonna use a plastic worm, Bondy worms, obviously, because they're a lot tougher than most baits out there. And I will take this, a good jig, fine wire hook on it. You want good hooks. I use Damo's custom tackle most of the time. And what's different of these new jigs that are out today, they're powder coated ones, versus back in the day is, I remember going to Sunset Bait and Tackle in LaSalle and buying them jigs that cost 25 cents. And those hooks would never dig in like that. You could never get a jig hook to do that. I don't know how we even caught anything back then using our monofilament and our jigs that, I mean, I didn't even pull on it. It stick right in your nail. That's a huge thing. Do not cheap out on your jigs, number one. When you put the plastic on there, you got to thread that thing on there as straight as you can possibly do it. If you don't get it straight on there, take it off, redo it, get it on there as straight as possible. The reason is you want to go straight down the center of the base because you'll get line twist. And the line twist is caused, if that thing's not straight, it's going to go like this on the way up and like this on the way down. So have it straight is crucial. I use a stinger hook all the time. I never used to. I do now. With my customers, if we come in 2 fish shy, I'd be wishing I had a stinger hook. So that's why I always put them on now. Started using them probably, I don't know, 20 years ago. Before that, I would just use straight hook and we'd miss a lot of fish. So I use a minnow on this exact rig. I'll use a minnow, put it through the lift, small emerald shiner, and then I take an old piece of plastic worm. Instead of wondering if your minnow's gone on the bottom of the river, I'd take a small little tab of plastic worm and I'd push it on there after my minnow. Just the tiniest piece of an old worm. Just push it on there and you pin that minnow down there, it won't come off. That's really crucial. So I'll use a minnow till water's about 45 degrees, and then I'm done with the minnow for the year. Unless we get a cold front, then I'll get some minnows again. If we get like 3rd week of April and it's 50-degree water and we get a cold snap and you're seeing your breath in that, get some minnows. Definitely helps you. There's a big debate always in the spring on the internet. Of course, you go to the internet for all your fishing knowledge. Use a swivel or tie direct to the jig. I do not tie direct to the jig. If you, one thing I tell people, okay, when you're fishing, ask yourself at all times, multiple times during the day, if I was to get a bite right now, would I be in position to set the hook? And oftentimes, if you have tied your jig direct to the braid, what'll happen is when you go to set the hook, you won't realize it, but because of twist in your line, that braid will be wrapped around the tip like that. And when you go to, if you've ever tried to set the hook with braid around the tip, it doesn't budge. You can't reel. You look like an idiot trying to reel, and it's all caught up there. That's because without that swivel, if you can have that on there as straight as possible, it's still going to do some twisting. And what's going on is that line is twisted on here, and what it's doing is it's bouncing up on that island. It happened to me a million times in my life. That braid bounces up. You don't want to do it musky jigging, trust me. That braid bounces up, gets around the tip. You go to set the hook, you can't reel it in. It's because you didn't use a swivel. Now these guys say, well, I've never had a problem. I tied direct to the jig, blah, blah, blah. Let me tell you what. This braid is so uniform. You don't know where it's going to break. How many times have you caught a jig off the bottom and it's got 40 yards of braid on it? It's because the guys are not using this here, which breaks off. I would rather break this off than have my customer with 40 yards of line out and it breaks off at the spool right here. Because at some point, this stuff is so uniform, at some point there's going to be a weak spot somewhere. Maybe there was a bird's nest or something like a month earlier and you got a weak spot way down in there. Next thing you know, you bust off the whole thing. You don't want to do that. So you save your line, you reduce the line twist, and I would much rather have a fish seeing this clear line, right, than this thick braid where it's opaque, right? So I always use a swivel. You don't go too small either, because I've gone too small and had my line cut set and hook. So I use basically, you can use like a number 7 is probably the most common one that I use when I'm jigging. Okay. Always be aware of your surroundings when you're fishing too. When you're, and that not just, I'm not talking about fish jumping and things like that. I'm talking about your buddy in the boat who's whacking you, catching way more fish than you. You got to look at his rhythm. You're watching your surroundings. That includes your buddy and how he's catching them, and the jig he's using, and the angle he's on, and doing what he's doing. Is he holding it there a little bit? Is he doing a little harder snap? I'm not gonna tell you what movement to do. Just keep it moving. Some guys are faster, some guys are slower. Keep it hopping. That's the one tip that I tell people. So what I do is I'll have multiple types of rigs ready to go when I'm jigging, because they're not always going to hit the standard plastic worm. There's always going to be something that works a little bit better. And what I do is always have something different on the deck ready to go, because one profile is always going to work better than another. You just got to keep moving and keep trying stuff new. Don't get stuck with doing the same thing every time with the same color. The guys that win big tournaments, they found something subtle that no one else figured out. It's some speed of their retrieve or where they're hopping it. Those are the guys that are champion fishermen. The guys that look at those little subtle things and figure it out. They always beat the guy who's catching them on his brown worm from 1992. You know, always trying to find something working better than what you're currently doing. You'll always find something better. So I'm going to tell you a little story. I'm going to talk about profiles of baits here. If you think that all the bait that those fish are after are all the same size down there all the time, you're mistaken. And that should really impact what you're going to use. If you're using a tiny jig, like you're trying to go all finesse because the water's clear, and they're feeding on giant prey down there, you're not going to get them, right? Let me tell you a couple stories. I was in a Bassmaster tournament at a Buffalo, New York one time, and I was doing good. And I had to get in the top 10. You get on the Bassmaster Elite Series, you got to get in the top 10 to go on the last day, and you get a cameraman in your boat or whatever. And on the one day of that tournament, I was very high up. And the one day of the tournament, it was dead calm. And I had this partner, this was in Lake Erie, I had this amateur partner fishing on the back of the boat. He shows up with a 4-pound line and an ultralight rod. And I'd never seen that in a big tournament with huge smallmouth. We get out there fishing, and these are the exact jigs I still have. He gave me this jig. I have them. See that there? That little tiny thing? We're on the biggest bass smallmouth fishery in the world, where everybody's whacking 4 and 5 pounders. This guy throws 4-pound test, and he puts that little panfish bait out there. And I was just going with my drop shot, you know, standard Berkeley worm or whatever. This guy starts stroking me from the back of the boat. I mean, sheephead, walleye, bass, everything. I could not catch a fish. I was in the midst of having a meltdown in this event. In the end, I ended up 11th, 1 ounce out of, I had a dead fish, and I was 1 ounce out of getting on the TV day. That's another story, but that day I only had 17 pounds. That day I fished with him. what I started doing is I started taking my worm, and I would make a worm out of, I was using Berkeley Gulp, and I would make a worm that big, and I put it on my drop shot. All of a sudden, I start hammering. So something happened that day where they wanted that tiny little thing. Another day I was out there, and I wasn't catching nothing until I did that. Literally nothing. This guy was killing me on my spots that I spent all this time finding, and I was doing good, you know. Another time we were in the river, I got to give one of my customers, Mark, frequent customer, got to give him credit for this. We were jigging behind Fighting Island, and we were doing okay. We weren't slaughtering them. He puts this big thing down there. It's a jigging wrap with a big old minnow bait on the back. He was using a great big sluggo, like a 5-inch sluggo on the back of like the biggest jigging wrap. And I'm looking at this thing, he's like, oh, I'm gonna try it. All of a sudden, he starts wailing on them, the big ones, hitting this great big thing like that. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So there's two contrasting stories where don't get stuck using that same worm all the time. Use big stuff. If there's big perch down there, if there's big gizzard shad down there, use the big stuff. If it's tiny little emerald shiners, go downsize. They don't always want the standard stuff. It's always important. So when I'm jigging, I'm always trying to find the profile that works that day. It could be a blade bait. Could be the Bondy baitfish, a minnow shape like this. There's always something that's going to work better than something else. The profile, the more I fish, the more I pay attention to not just color, but the profile of the bait. There's been many days where the worms just didn't work. The plastics just didn't work. And we put the Bondy blade down there, which I don't know if you've ever used one of these or a blade bait in general. The first real ones that I was aware of were Silver Buddies. They were from Tennessee. And then the Cicada came out from Reef Runner. We made one out of my logo. I love blade baits so much, I think I am the only person to have ever had a top 10 in a Bassmaster tournament on a blade bait. Caught them in New York on it. And I've had this love affair with them. It's just a chunk of metal, and it's got a lead on the front, a couple of trebles, and you jig it. You jig it just like your plastics. You can cast them if you're on the lake, but you feel it vibrate, like a violent vibration, and then you let it fall slow. And as soon as it touches the bottom, you jig it up, you let it fall slow. There's some days they want the metal blade bait. So if you're gonna do one thing this year, it's have 3 or 4 different profiles on the boat when you're jigging. Have different rods set up with different profiles. Make a couple passes with the worm. If that ain't happening, drop that bait fish down there or finesse, whatever. Keep trying different profiles, and one profile is gonna dominate that day. It may not work the next day, but keep trying different profiles, not just colors. So remember, if I can tell you anything, is the colors on the times that the colors matter most to me is when the water's super cold. The scientists claim that walleye see the best when the water is ice cold. It helps their eye for vision wise. Theory, I don't know how they know that, but if you're going to really pay attention to color and really try a bunch of different colors, it's when the water's super cold like it is right now. One last thing I want to show you guys that I want before Mark comes up. We're going to have a little break in between. You guys can, we've got some great food here from Jose's Bar and Grill. Those guys were so awesome to bring that for us. We're going to have a little snack, and we're going to take a little break, and then Mark's going to come up. But I know you guys have probably seen my drop shot video that I just put out. And if you want to try something new in the river, if the jigging in general isn't panning out, try this. You can use the same rods as when you were vertical jigging. This is a typical bass fishing drop shot rig. The only difference is I put on a relatively short leader. I got a Bondy worm on here because again, the Bondy worms, they don't come off. I use the same plastic when we make our musky baits. This is the same plastic. That's why they're durable like that. Everybody else wants you to have their baits ripped so you buy more. I want customers to have value. I use this in a river you watch that video, I'm right behind Fighting Island, I'm by the water intake, and all I'm doing is I'm just using this drop shot rig, and I'm just slowly lifting it like this, just keeping it off the bottom to keep it from dragging. So I'm jigging essentially, but I'm just lifting that bait slowly off the bottom to keep it from dragging. I set it back to the bottom, jig it up again, set it back to the bottom, and what happens is that hook and that worm, this is a one, I believe it's a #1 Gamakatsu circle hook. Whenever you're drop shotting, remember this. Use a circle hook. The circle hooks have the beak that turns in like this. When you get that fish in the roof of that mouth, if that beak turns in and starts pointing back towards the shaft, those are the best hooks you can use for a drop shot. This thing, when you have the, instead of having that big jig on there going like this thing just hovering right in front of them fish. It's in the same strike zone as your jig is. It's just sitting there like this, right above the bottom, just like that. There's something about it. It's magical some days. You gotta try that. You don't need, like I'm, in that video, I'm in the shipping lane. I'm using 3/8 ounce drop shot weight. And the reason I'm using such a light weight is because there's no plastic attached to this thing. So you can imagine if you used a 3/8 ounce jig with no plastic on it, you'd have no problem feeling the bottom. And that's the same with this. So you can go ahead and use heavier weights if you want. But on a drop shot rig, you'll always catch, whether it's bass or you always catch more fish with a lighter weight that you can get away with. Give this a try this year. I'm using the same situation. So I've got braid with a swivel. You know, when I'm bass fishing for drop shotting out in the lake, I don't use a swivel. But when I'm doing this, since it's in the current and it's possibly spinning around, use a swivel. And you guys gotta try this year. It's pretty awesome. People were asking me earlier about my leader material. I use fluorocarbon because I have it, right? You can use, if you don't want to spend the money, you can use just plain fishing line. I use 10 to 12 pound. I don't go any higher than 12. I think it's a little too stiff. So fluorocarbon is superior fishing line compared to monofilament. It doesn't stretch. It's when they make it, it's compacted tighter together, so it's a higher quality material. If you have some laying around, I would definitely, it's about triple the price of regular fishing line. So if you're really intense fisherman, go ahead and buy some. But since it's such a short piece, regular monofilament's just fine for your leader material. But always use that swivel so you don't have to break off 40 yards of line when you snag the bottom. So guys, that's about it for me. We're gonna have Mark come up. We're gonna take a few questions.
What size swivel do you use on there, John?
This is a 7, but you could use like a 10.
Pound capacity.
Oh man, I think they're 75 pounds. This is the same swivel I put on the back of my muskie jigs. I just use the same one. I've never had a problem. If you go too small, you risk cutting line, and that's happened to me before. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Have you tried that, like, instead of hot bouncing, have you tried a drop shot?
In May?
No, in the summertime, when you start bottom bouncing.
I'm usually bottom bouncing. Yeah, it'll work. I would bet it would work all year. Yeah.
Kids and stuff, you don't get hung up.
Yep. Yeah, the bottom bouncing. Boy, I made a video on that on the Bondy Bait YouTube channel. If you haven't done that, that's a blast, and it's easy for kids to do too. Anybody else, sir?
John, what knots are you using on the hook and on the weight?
That on this?
Yeah.
I use a knot. It doesn't really have a name other than drop shot knot.
You want to go through so your hook stands up.
Yes, this thing stands straight out. If I used to use a Palomar knot, okay, that was the knot that everybody said you got to use with a drop shot. And then Aaron Martin's the drop shot king. He told me about that curved in beak on the hook. He also told me about this knot called a double clinch knot, and I've used that for 15 years. But then I found this knot called a drop shot knot, and it's the easiest knot you could ever imagine tying. And that holds it out better than any knot I've found. Most of my, so on a sinker, a drop shot sinker, if you've ever seen these sinkers, if you've never used one, it's not a traditional sinker. It's got a peak like this. Okay? And all you do is you tie a single overhand knot on the end of your line, you poke it through that hole, and you cinch it up into that V. And that's all it is. It's Japanese. Drop shot came out of Japan. When I tie my other baits on, almost all the time, I'm using a knot that you need to look up. It's called a San Diego jam knot. I learned it from a saltwater guide. It's basically essentially a noose. Look up a San Diego jam knot. If you take a Palomar knot and you don't tie it right and it's looped over itself, you could snap it in your hands. Try a San Diego jam knot. One bait that I forgot to talk about is a jigging spoon. I don't know if you guys have ever used jigging spoons in this river. You want to talk about a blast. I know people that use these things exclusively now. And it's just, it's like a southern bass thing. A lot of guys use it down south. A lot of guys use it for like white bass and stuff down south. And you just do a little bit of a quicker snap. You use braid with a leader again. A little bit of a quicker snap on this thing and then it flutters back down. And there's certain days where they just love this thing. It's just another thing to add to your profile selection on the deck there. Jigging spoons, they work fantastic. I would go with the 3/4 ounce size. The 1/2 ounce are a little light. Yes, sir.
If you're on a drift, how many times should you make that drift if you're not getting bit? And what should you do to shake things up a little bit? Change your profile, should you move, go somewhere else, call a buddy, ask them if they're fighting over there? What should you do?
That depends.
How long should you wait?
That depends. If you got 4 guys in the boat and you're all using different stuff and no one's caught nothing, you need a severe depth change first.
If you're marking fish.
If you're marking fish, they could be suckers or carp. I don't know. If you're marking fish, change your baits. Change the profile of the bait. That's when I would go from a plat. In that situation, if you're seeing fish and you guys all got plastics on, you ain't catching them, you need to put the blade bait on there. That thing could turn fish on like no tomorrow some days. That's the first thing I would do. If I'm seeing fish and I ain't catching them, I'd put the blade bait on. And you'll feel that, they feel that vibration. You should feel the vibration of those things. It's fantastic. But yeah, if no one's got a fish, you need a depth change. And, a couple of depth, like when I say depth change, I'm going from like 18 to 25.
So depth change in the same area.
Depth change in the same area, and then maybe one guy should pick up another profile. You gotta have a bunch of rods ready to go, and be observant. Be willing to do that. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Be willing to make those changes, and you will catch more fish in a year. That's right.
Question on jig selection for weight.
Yeah.
Because over the past few years, it used to be half and 5/8 ounce, and now it's like 1 ounce and 3/4.
I find that the guys that come into this store here that are buying the 1 ounces are either new or downtown in the deepest water, or they're thrown on shore. The guys that are on shore, almost all of them are using 1 ounces. So you got to zing it up there. It's got to get to the bottom quick, and then I personally use 5/8 probably 90% of the time, but I'm shallower than everybody else, right? Most of the jigs, the #1 seller in my store here is probably 3/4, because that kind of covers everything. And then the plastics on the stingers, yeah, definitely. The 3/4 probably sell better than the 5/8 slightly, yeah. But it's super windy. Like, I don't even have a 1 ounce jig in my boat, let's put it that way. If it's super windy, you can stay on that trolling motor and you're effective at it, you can feel the bottom just about anything, really. Yes, sir.
As far as line goes, you buy a spool of fluorocarbon line, how long does that spool last in your boat before you gotta buy another spool?
Fluorocarbon is extremely high quality. It doesn't get brittle, it's not affected by sunlight, it doesn't absorb water, so it is so much better, and that's why it costs more. It's more difficult to make. So I don't know on like length of time, but I can tell you this, it is superior to regular fishing line.
On that, like if you have an old school of mono, if you look at it, it's all
Powdery.
Powdery now.
Yep.
Yeah. I've got a school.
That's why, those 3,600 yards of mono are only $45, right? I bought one at Gander Mountain one time. It was this big that I used for years. I paid $8 in the clearance bin for it. It's probably what they bought it for, So it's hard biting a bullet on that fluorocarbon, but it doesn't stretch. You take a piece of mono with a pair of gloves, you'll stretch it out like this. Fluorocarbon is very difficult. Yes, sir.
How long are you making your leaders where you're switching the braids and flow?
I'm generally like, I'll show you. That would be about max. I don't want to go too much longer. the problem I have is if you're gonna break off at some point, you wanna have a little slack there to retie, but if I make them any longer than that, my customers end up reeling the leader into, or the eyelet in the eyelet here, the swivel, and busting a hide. So I try to get that perfect, you know, I don't know, 16, 18 inches, you know? Anything longer than that, you're gonna reel it up into the eye. Yes, sir.
What's your preferred color of braid? There's so many different shades.
Yeah, the stuff I got on here is green, because I was bass fishing with this stuff last in the summer. But generally, I'm using the yellow or the flame green. That stuff is, you know, when COVID hit, I had trouble getting the yellow, and I called Shimano, they own Power Pro, and I said, listen, man, I will buy $2,000 in this 10-pound yellow right now. And the guy at Shimano said, I don't have a spool. He said, everyone on Detroit River uses it, and we sent it to Louisiana for something. He goes, that's the only place that buys it. And he goes, we don't have any. So, yes, sir.
You use the offset drop shot hooks with double eyes and you tie the bottom, go through the bottom?
I don't, because the early ones that come out would break. The VMC ones, they had problems with them breaking at first. I have some Gamakatsu ones in there. They are not cheap, but I find that I'm trying to be, when you're drop shotting, it's a subtle thing. It's a subtle technique, so why would you want all that extra wire on there? It's 2 knots you gotta tie when you do that, right? You tie one of these you go on YouTube and look up drop shot knot, you'll see the exact knot. It doesn't even have a name, I don't think. You'll see the exact knot I'm talking about, and it's the best thing going. Give that a try. Any other questions before we have a little break? Yes, one more.
Do you ever tie line to line with a swivel when you're drop shotting?
When I'm bass fishing, I'll tie braid to fluorocarbon, and I use a double uni. And what I do is I tie like 2 more turns on the braid than I do on the fluoro, and that helps it from slipping.
You try that FG knot yet?
I don't use that knot, no. I'm just old school.
It's a knot for 2 like kind of knot.
Yep, I'm gonna try it. Anybody else, or we're gonna have a little break here. Yeah, one more.
You ever throw a free rig?
A free rig?
Yeah.
No.
It's, from what I've heard, it's similar to a drop shot, but the weight slides freely on the line instead of the hook sliding.
Is that right? Probably come out of Japan again. That's where most of this finesse stuff comes out of. Yes, sir, one more.
Anything wrong with using a uni knot to connect the two and then using a swivel down with the lure?
I don't use swivels or snaps on my lures because it's unnatural. For one, most of them are cheap and they break. And that snap will come undone. Even when I'm musky fishing, I never try not to use snaps. I make my own leaders. I have a swivel on one end with a split ring and a swivel to the line. Because I've had so many times, I'll tell you a story. One of my customers was lake trout fishing up north, trying to catch a 50-pound lake trout. He spent his whole career trying to catch a 50-pound lake trout. Finally, they hook one. They get it to the top. Him and the guide look down, the snap's open. On a big, the spoon was down, this 50-pounders thing made one more turn, off he went. Same customers out fish with me, hooks about a 48-inch muskie. We look down, snap's open. One turn, off the fish went. Same scenario, same customer. I make my own musky leaders out of downrigger cable and I put a swivel on each end. You see all these fancy different snaps and stuff. I don't want that near my lure. It's not natural. It's easy. Yeah, it's easy to switch in that cold weather. It's just not natural. And it's doomed to fail, you know? And so serious guys who do serious fishing, they don't use it. All right, let's have some chicken wings.